بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين صلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد سيد الأولين والآخرين وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين وصحابته الغر الميامين ومن تبعهم بإحسان وهدى إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وجعلنا من خيرة أمة سيدنا محمد عليه أفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته to all of you. Alhamdulillah, we are now, I think, is this week 4? I lose track. This is week 4 but session 3 of our series on Imam al-Ghazali, this introductory series to the Imam. And as promised this week, having had a look at his, taken a decent look at his life, his biography, having looked at his what did we do last week? I've forgotten. Oh, his life in context. That's what it was. I've forgotten. He's looking at his life in context, in the context of his times. As someone texted me and said, that was a great history lesson. Sort of 500 years in the blink of an eye. What we're now going to do is have a look at his oeuvre. And oeuvre is a French word of which there is really no equivalent in English, other than perhaps authorship. So look at the works that he wrote and the effect that those works had. We talk about how influential Imam Ghazali was. He was perhaps certainly the most influential Muslim in the last 1,000 years. The question is, how did he wield that influence? How did he come to have such an influence? And the answer is, he came to have the influence not by dint of his teaching per se, but by dint of the works that he wrote. So if you look at someone like Abu Hanifa as a comparator, Abu Hanifa, Shafi'i, Malik, all let's move Shafi'i out for the time being, but certainly Abu Hanifa and Malik, incredibly influential people who set the course of Muslim scholarship really from their time onwards. But they were not renowned primarily for the works that they wrote, but rather for the teaching that they did. And it was their students who conveyed their teaching, built them up, worked on them, transmitted them, and then you got the formation of these madhabs, these systems, these collegial systems of students of the Imam, his students, their students, and this teaching process that continues in this way, the process of learning, of extrapolation of what you've learned and so forth, building on it, critiquing the madhab, you're critiquing your own madhab, strengthening it and so forth, and that's how you get this madhab. Now, there is no Ghazalian madhab. There is no madhab of Ghazali. There is no Sufi tariqa of Ghazali. Right? So, someone who was his younger contemporary, for example, Shaykh al-Jilani, Sayyidina Shaykh al-Jilani, who also wrote a lot of his discourses were written down, but he was an incredibly influential person. A great swathe of Muslims for a large part of Muslim history were affiliated in one way or another to Shaykh al-Jilani through the Qadri tariqa. How did he have that influence? How did that influence spread in that way? And on the basis of his teachings, of the students that he produced, the Khalifas that he produced, who went out into the Muslim world and passed on that teaching. Okay? Now, Ghazali, of course, had students. He had students who transmitted from him, alright, and so forth. However, there is no Ghazalian madhab. There's no Sufi order that is named after Ghazali. There is no Ghazalian tariqa. There's no Ghazalian madhab. Right? There's no school of fiqh that's named after Ghazali. So on what basis do we say that he was such an influential scholar? Or he was such an influential human being? And it was really on the basis of the works that he wrote. This is Ghazali as author. And having that tremendous influence on the basis of the works that he wrote. In a similar way, the great scholars of hadith, Bukhari, Muslim, and so forth, their primary influence that echoed down through the centuries was on the basis of the works that they wrote. And it's the same for Ghazali. And that's why, in terms of understanding the influence of Ghazali, it's important to look at his authorship, or the works that he wrote over his life. Now, on that note, there is this which has been passed around. This, hopefully I printed out about 30 copies. That should probably suffice for people who are here. I think it has been emailed. There should be some around. It has been emailed as well. And what it's a PDF, sort of a PDF document. The email that you will have received will have 4 pages. Okay, it'll have 4 pages. The document itself that's printed out is only 2 pages, and it looks basically like this. Right? And what it is the oeuvre or the authorship of Hujjatul Islam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. The way this works, well, I'll go through it. It's probably the easiest thing. I'll just go through it. So we are going to be taking today a look at a look at his works in general, and then focusing down on some specific works, the most influential of his works, and looking at his influence as a theologian, as a philosopher, as a logician, as a scholar of fiqh, and then his primary influence, which was in tasawwuf, which was in Islamic spirituality. Okay? But in order to do this, and this is the type of lesson, and I'll apologize right at the outset, this is the type of lesson that you will either find fascinating or boring, depending on your outlook on things. So that's the warning right up at the right off the bat. Okay, this is an academic survey of the works of Ghazali. So, first, a few general principles. We often look, when we talk about scholars, we talk about the works that they wrote. There's a very simple question that we ask here. How do you know that scholar wrote the work? That's a simple question. Right? If I say to you, so-and-so wrote something, well, how do you know? So you can look at style of writing, you can look at references, you can look at... There are ways, but the point is, in terms of historical criticism, you have to adopt a initially skeptical approach. How do I know that this scholar wrote this work? Okay? This, as you proceed in your studies, this is something that you will start to think about. Alright? Certainly when you get to what are sometimes known as sometimes called the lesser known works of a scholar, determining how he wrote, determining if he wrote it, determining when he or she wrote that work is quite important in understanding their life. So, there are some I've just put just a few sort of general principles down, and you can take them or leave them. It's useful for you to have. I wrote it out because I was doing it, and this might not be useful to you when you are going through Sharh Miyat Amil, or you're going through you're learning Daraba Yadribu. But as you proceed, take it, file it away somewhere. You might find that you are referring back to it in 5 years' time. Okay? First point are the principles of establishing authenticity. Alright? Not every book attributed to an author was written by them. Alright? Not every book attributed to an author was written by them. Ghazali, for example, there are over 400 works that have been attributed to Ghazali. He probably only wrote about 50. I mean, 50 is a lot, but he probably only wrote about 50 works. Alright? Often you will find that in order to big up a scholar, the way you big up a scholar is you increase the number of works that he wrote. Okay? The number of works that you write doesn't really mean anything. The quality of the works that you wrote is everything. Bukhari wrote several works. He wrote several works. He wrote what's called al-Tarikh al-Kabir, for example, which is a history, which is a biography. It's called Tarikh, which means the great history, but actually what it is an account, a biographical account of all the people in the chains of narration that he related from. And there were about 40,000 people that he had done biographies of. That work's lost. It's not been preserved for whatever reason. Okay? He wrote a work, or a theological work, which relates to an issue, an issue of theology that was controversial in his day, and is still controversial in the sense that lots of questions about it, which is the creation of actions in a servant. When you do theology, you'll learn about all that stuff. The difference between, do you as a human being create your own actions, or does God create your actions? And if God creates your actions, then does that mean that God creates your sins as well? And how can God create sins? And Bukhari wrote a whole work on that. Okay, so there are works that he wrote. There weren't that many. Okay, but the main work, Sahih al-Bukhari, was of such high quality that really, if he'd not written anything else other than Sahih al-Bukhari, that would have been sufficient for his name to be written in the stars. Okay?
In terms of those books, do you still take them, or because he was known as a hadith, do we just take the books on hadith?
So what do you, if Imam Bukhari wrote a work on Aqidah, yes, he was a great muhaddith, but he writes a work on Aqidah. How do we judge that work on Aqidah? You judge that work on Aqidah on the basis of its merits. You don't say, oh, Bukhari wrote it, so it must be good. Not necessarily. Especially as we'll see when Ghazali, next week when we start going into the Munqidh, Ghazali makes this point very strongly. Just because somebody is an expert in one thing doesn't mean they're an expert in everything. Just because somebody is absolutely right about one thing doesn't mean they're not absolutely wrong about something else. Okay? And one of the lessons that Ghazali teaches us through his life and through his intellectual pursuit is the statement of Sayyidina Ali, لا تعرف الحق بالرجال لكن يعرف الحق تعرف أهله. Don't literally translation is, don't recognize the truth by people, rather know the truth and you will know its people. That is to say, don't assume just because my teacher is saying it, it must be the truth. Not necessarily. Know the truth. If you know the truth, you will know who is speaking the truth and who is mistaken. Know the truth and you will know its people. Okay? So, and he takes his point down. I mean, I've just got delivery of a book by Stephen Hawking called The Grand Design, which is Stephen Hawking, great astrophysicist, his theory of everything, basically. Okay, his creation myth, effectively. All right, the creation myth of Stephen Hawking. And what's very clear when you look at the book is that he's a great physicist, but a rubbish philosopher. And Ghazali makes exactly that same point. Just because somebody is a great logician doesn't make them a great theologian. Just because somebody is a great mathematician, and Ghazali makes exactly this point in the Munqidh, and we'll cover it next week. Just because someone is a great mathematician, Pythagoras, he takes the name of Pythagoras. He says Pythagoras was a great mathematician. He was an awesome mathematician. Pythagoras' theorem of triangles, excellent. Pythagoras as a philosopher was incredibly weak. He was a very, very weak philosopher. And Ghazali says that even the other Greek philosophers refuted Pythagoras in his philosophy. Just because he's good at maths doesn't mean he's good at philosophy. Similarly here, Bukhari was a great muhaddith. Was he a great faqih? He was a faqih, certainly. He was a great faqih. Was he great at the level of Shafi'i? Was he great at the level of Malik or Abu Hanifa? No. No. So you would take that work and you would assess it basically. Okay? And this is one of the interesting things about Ghazali, again, is that he authored works on a number of different fields. Okay? So there are a few scholars that you find their authorship extends to quite different fields. Alright? And it's a mark of the completeness of the ulum, of their kamal fil ulum, the completeness of their knowledge, that they authored masterworks in different fields. And we'll see that as we go through. So, many works were attributed to authors either through genuine mistakes, but also because unscrupulous authors used the names of famous scholars to promote and spread their own works. So, you are, Joe Bloggs living down the street in Alexandria. What do you write a work, you want people to read your work. What do? Well, you travel to, or you're in Nisapur, for example. What do? Well, you travel to, Damascus, and you say, I'm going to teach you this work. Ghazali wrote this work. And I dictated it from him. He dictated it to me. Now I'm going to teach it to you. That work becomes attributed to Ghazali. Because big people take you at your word. So what they will say is, قال الإمام حجة الإسلام أبو حامد al-Ghazali, as narrated by so-and-so, and off you go. Alright? So one needs to be careful. So there is a work, الرد الجميل على إلهية عيسى بصريح الإنجيل, which means a beautiful refutation, or the beautiful refutation of the divinity of Christ from the Gospels. From the Gospels themselves. And this work is attributed to Ghazali. It's and for reasons that we'll see in the next bullet point, you will see that this work was not written by Ghazali. Pretty definitively not written by Ghazali. As much as we might like to think it was written by Ghazali, it wasn't. Why? The author just knows far too much about Christian polemics. He just knows Christianity too well. He clearly has an insider's view of Christianity, which Ghazali didn't have. Yeah? And there are other reasons as well. So, it was probably written by a Coptic Christian convert to Islam. But it was given the name Ghazali because then people will read it. Yeah? Whereas anonymous author, it's... What did J.K. Rowling, what was that? She used some pseudonym when she wrote a book recently. Yeah? She used a pseudonym. She wrote another book, some other book, Casual Vacancy I think it was called. And she used a pseudonym. Okay? And she used a pseudonym and it came out that it was her, but if it hadn't been, it would have been. I think when she released the book, it was sitting at kind of Amazon have that sales rank thing. So this book was probably sitting like at 1 million or something. It was like he's like in a millionth place, and suddenly it came out that author is actually J.K. Rowling. What happens? It shoots straight up to the top of the bestseller charts. Why? Famous author, and that's exactly what people did. And especially in the times we're talking about, 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, really confusing time. Nobody's going to have a clue. I mean, 200 years later, the Mongols have sacked the whole of the Eastern Islamic world. Nisapur is gone. Tus is gone. The whole of Khorasan is gone. It's become Mongol territory. You pitch up suddenly out of the blue in Cairo and say, I've got a work of Ghazali. Who's going to argue with you? Okay? All right. Authenticating works requires much research, effort, and conjecture. All right? Quite a lot of conjecture, actually. All right? But it returns to several principles. Sometimes you just don't know. You do your best, but often you wouldn't know for certain. Okay? Right. Like what? First, and these are largely in order of strength. How do you know that Ghazali wrote, let's pick a work, Tahdhib al-Usul, right? So it's under Usul al-Fiqh, second box. Tahdhib al-Usul. How do you know that Ghazali wrote Tahdhib al-Usul? Because in a work that we definitely know that he wrote, the Mustasfa, his final work in Usul, he specifically says, I wrote al-Mustasfa because students found Tahdhib al-Usul difficult. Yeah? When I started teaching again in Nisapur, students wanted to study Usul al-Fiqh. I pick up Tahdhib al-Usul, and they say, oh, this is really hard. You wrote this quite a long time ago. We want your up-to-date ideas on Usul al-Fiqh. He says, fine. And he wrote he said, so I wrote the Mustasfa. Okay? The Tahdhib al-Usul belongs to Ghazali by his own attestation. And Ghazali does this a lot. He cross-references his works a lot. He will refer to his works. He will refer to works he's already written. He will say, for example, in the Ihya, for further information on this, refer to this book that I wrote. For further information on that, refer to that book that I wrote. Okay? Sometimes he will say, for further information on this, refer to my upcoming work, so and so. Or keep an eye out for Mi'yar al-Ilm, for example. So you've got a really good idea with Ghazali what he wrote and what he didn't write. Okay? The next is the attestation of contemporaries and students. So if Al-Farisi, for example, says, I studied this work of Ghazali with him, well, it's pretty strong. That's a pretty strong evidence. Contemporary biographers who say that Ghazali wrote this, this, and this, again, that's pretty strong. And also later scholars who are well known for being muhaqqiqeen, that is to say, they didn't just say, oh, I heard Ghazali wrote this work. They say, I went and checked. And they did their own, and they were very, very thorough. They had their own, they didn't explain what processes, but they had their own processes of verifying. They would ask around, they would cross-reference with other biographical works. They did a lot of that work for us. So that's the second way. The third way, circumstantial evidence. A handwritten manuscript, for example, that is dated or signed. It coincides with the author's life. I finished this work. If Ghazali wrote in a work, I finished this work in Damascus. I finished this work in Damascus in the year, on the 1st of Ramadan in the year 485 of the Hijrah. Baba Ghazali, we know Ghazali wasn't in Damascus. Ghazali was in Baghdad. So clearly that work has not been written by Ghazali unless he's really made a mistake with his dates. Yeah, but he was very precise, because remember, if you're writing that work then and there, you're not saying 10 years later, oh, I wrote that work in 485. When you finish the handwritten manuscript, you are saying completed on, so you begun here, ended here. You're not going to get the date wrong. And you're certainly not going to get the place wrong. Okay? So Shaykh Muhammad al-Yaqubi, for example, has a manuscript of Sahih Muslim that was dated and signed by Jalaluddin Suyuti, the great muhaddith Jalaluddin Suyuti, the great Egyptian mujtahid scholar. Okay? And it's date, and he signed his name and he dates it. Right? So he wrote it himself. Katabahu Abdul Faqir Jalaluddin Suyuti. Yeah? If you look at the date, Suyuti wrote it when he was 16 years old. So he finished the study of it, must have been, and Shaykh Muhammad explained to us, it is in all likelihood the very first read through of Sahih Muslim that Suyuti did. 16 years old, and he signed and he dated it. Okay? And Shaykh Muhammad, it's very interesting. He says how he got it. Yeah? He says when scholars in Damascus pass away, sometimes their kids are not particularly interested in studies, and these guys have got loads and loads of books. So what they do is they just pack them all up into boxes, and they say, garage sale, basically. It's like a car boot sale. Come and take what you want. And Shaykh Muhammad says, and all the scholars would go. When the scholar passed away, Fatiha ila ruhi Imam, let's go and buy his books, that sort of thing. So he went, and he bought a box. There was a box. He said, how much for the box? X amount. There you go. Got the box. Right? And he's going through this box, and he finds this manuscript, 10th century manuscript or 11th century manuscript, yeah, handwritten. And he said, okay, because Shaykh Muhammad's got something, I think he told us once, 16,000 books. 16,000 books, a large part of which are manuscripts, handwritten manuscripts. And this is what scholars do, real scholars, not people like me. We buy the ones that look pretty, but real scholars look for the manuscripts, right? And he had this, and he says, I'm going through this manuscript, and my eyes almost fell out when I saw what was written on the last page. Because he realized immediately, because Shaykh Muhammad his expertise is in thubat. His expertise is in chains of transmission, actually. That's what his special interest is. So he knows when, all the different names of different scholars, especially the famous ones, when they were born, when they passed away, where they were at certain times, because that's what you need for that science. And he said, I knew immediately this was a very early manuscript. And I went back to that guy, the guy who sold me this box, this crate of books. And I said, do you know what you sold me? Do you know what you sold? What was in your father's, in this box of your father's? He said, this manuscript is worth probably, if you're on the open market, £100,000. Just this manuscript. First, I mean, you talk about this like a first edition Shakespeare. Yeah? £100,000. Yeah? But a first edition Shakespeare written by Shakespeare in his handwriting. Yeah? The guy said, oh, give it back to me. He said, no, mine now. You sold it to me. Yeah? So that's handwritten manuscripts and so forth. Then you come to style and language, and style and language comes afterwards. So Ghazali, for example, is very ordered, very logical. He's got a work, for example, Jawahir al-Quran, the pearls and the jewels and the pearls of Quran, which is a very rhetorical work. There's lots of kind of rhetorical flourishes in this work. But it's still, Ghazali can't help himself. He has to classify things. And he kind of says, and this is broken down into 3 categories. This category is broken down into 3 categories. This category is broken down into 2 categories. This category has 10, and he always does that in all of his work. You have this very clear. You read the first 10 pages of a book by Ghazali, you know exactly what's in it. You know exactly what you're going to get. Because he classifies it very, very nicely. Yeah? Then the last one is the content. And that which contradicts the well-known positions of the author, or it contains meanings or language or expressions that are out of character. These would be called into question. So a good example in Ghazali's case is a work that he wrote called Mizanul Amal, which means the just balance. It's a work on ethical theory. What makes things good and what makes things bad. Okay? And some scholars, certainly modern scholars, have queried whether Ghazali actually wrote this work, although he does, you know, you can't really query it because Ghazali himself references the work in other works of his. But because its style and its content rather is so different from other works that he wrote, there'd always be a bit of a question mark hanging over its head. All right. So this is how you look at authentication of works to determine which works the author actually did right. And again, why is it important? Well, it's important because for all that we say, you know, the truth is known through people and what have you. The fact is, if you say قال al-Ghazali, that holds a lot of weight. So it's important to know what Ghazali called. It's important to know what he actually said. All right, especially if you are making a point. We had someone asked me a question. Someone asked me a question just the other day about a fetus with congenital abnormalities, and whether the mother could abort the fetus or not. You know. And I wasn't sure. I had a pretty good idea what the answer was, but I wasn't sure. And talking about it, as I was explaining, talking about it in a class is one thing. Talking about it when there's actual mother there waiting to have an abortion done is a completely different matter. Yeah. So I phoned a friend, as you do. I phoned Sheikh Amjad, and I said, Sheikh, what's the situation? He said, look, I'm not sure. And we had a kind of quite a long discussion about it. He went to go back and look at it. I went to go back and look at it. I found some references. But I said the thing is, you're talking about definitive knowledge that the baby has significant congenital abnormalities. The baby's organs, the bottom half of the body hadn't developed. The baby's organs were growing on the outside of the body. Go on, what is it? Yeah, Atif, vignette. Huh? See, that's why Atif comes to the class. Help me out with these words, difficult words, right? Right. But the mother had been told by the doctors, look, this baby, the chances of survival are incredibly small. We're offering you an abortion. Okay? So I said, look, the thing is, you can't look to classical works for the answer here, because outwardly there'd be no issue with the pregnancy. The pregnancy would just be carrying on. Yeah? There'd be no sign that this was a problem. And under those circumstances, the fuqaha would not be able to give a ruling. There would be no detailed discussion about if the baby has a congenital abnormality at that very early stage of pregnancy, can you abort a fetus or not? So we need to find modern references. Right? Do you understand what I'm saying? It's a bit like saying, you know, if you ask the fuqaha, you know, what direction do you pray if you're on a spaceship? Or how do you keep a fast if you're on a spaceship orbiting the Earth? Well, there would be no reference point for that specific question. There'd be things you could take analogies from, But no faqih has actually sat down and mulled over in their head, if you're orbiting the earth and every 90 minutes you're making a complete orbit of the earth, how do you fast? Because the day would be 45 minutes long. So how do you fast? No faqih would have, in classical times, would have actually sat down and contemplated on that specific question. Although it should be borne in mind that you do get surprises sometimes. So I was asked a question once. You travel from, I've got to get this the right way around. You travel from London to New York. Okay? When you leave London, the sun has set. Okay? You've prayed Maghrib, you've got on the plane. When you get to New York, you've overtaken the sun. The sun has not yet set in New York. When the sun sets in New York, do you pray Maghrib? Now this is a real situation. This happens. You've already prayed Maghrib, right? But now you're experiencing a sunset again. Yeah. Now you'd think that is a perfect example of something that does not occur in the fiqh books, but it does. But it does. Famously, it occurs in the fiqh books, and the mas'ala is this: a wali, a friend of God, prays Maghrib in one city, and then through his karama, through his miraculous abilities, transports himself to another town where Maghrib has not yet occurred and the sun sets. Does he pray Maghrib? And the answer is yes. Yes. Because the sabab, the proximal cause of the Maghrib prayer is the setting of the sun. Whenever the sun sets, you pray Maghrib. So actually, that is a question that, because there were walis in those days and these things happened, and it's interesting that people, how would people, they had either the scientific knowledge or they actually had a wali come to them and say, I transported myself from Delhi to Baghdad, I came to make, I decided, I was sitting in Indonesia and I decided I wanted to make Hajj. So I just kind of went, I clicked my heels together 3 times and I want to go home, and I end up in Mecca. How do I pray? Yeah, the fact that question is asked either indicates that Muslims had an advanced knowledge of science, so that they knew that the sun set in different times at different parts of the world. I.e., for that you have to have a round globe. Okay, that only works with a round globe. All right. And they knew that walis could transport themselves, so they dreamt up a hypothetical situation. Now, if this had been in Hanafi textbooks, you would say, yeah, Hanafi's being hypothetical. But it isn't in the Hanafi books. It is in the Hanafi books, but it's also in the Shafi'i books. Now, I can well imagine that kind of Shaykh al-Qadir Jilani kind of did this, then kind of sat and thought, should I pray Maghrib now again? I don't know. That's their concern. But that would be a precedent for space travel, for all that sort of stuff. Yeah? But sometimes you have no precedent, or that specific question hasn't been asked. So we went, and Shaykh Amjad found a reference from a modern fiqh academy. And it basically said, congenital abnormality that is either incompatible with life, interestingly, or that the baby would live but their life would be miserable. Or that the baby would live but the mother's life would be miserable. Like really miserable, not just difficult, but really miserable. Prior to 4 months, you can abort. And that's kind of, it went a bit further than I thought it would. But that's there. Now what's the question? What's the question now? Do I pick up the phone and tell mum? Go for it? No. There's another question. Who said so? Who are these people who said so? Are they reliable? And I don't mean are they, morally trustworthy. I mean, are they academically reliable or not? Do they have sufficient knowledge of the Sharia? Which I'm sure they do. But do they work within accepted methodologies? Or is it, it's acceptable because there's a hadith that says this? Well, that's not fiqh. Fiqh is not, here's a hadith, here's the ruling. That's not what fiqh is. What's the methodological framework they're adopting? Are they adopting genuine methodological frameworks? And yes, they were, it turned out so. That's fine. The position was there. You've got a position you can rely on, and you go. But the question is, there is that question that comes. who said so. So someone just came to ask me now, can you sell video games? Can you sell video games? And I'm like, why are you asking that question? He said, no, I heard you can't sell video games. Who said? Shaykh Hamza Yusuf. Oh, that's not what I was expecting. That wasn't the answer I was expecting. Yeah? That wasn't the answer I was expecting. So, okay, now what? Had he said, and this is my own arrogance, but Maulana so-and-so from the Diyal said, no, you can't sell video games, then I would have said, well, Maulana so-and-so. But now, Shaykh Hamza, now you got to think twice, 3 times, 4 times. Why? Because as much as we say, know the truth and you will know its people, i.e., if you understand, if you've got the truth, you will know who's correct and who's incorrect. The fact is, we are absolutely swayed by people that we have a high opinion of. If someone says this because it's that person saying it, they may be right, they might be wrong. The definition of a faqih is one who gets it right more than they get it wrong. That's the definition of a faqih. One who gets it, man غَلَبَ صَوَابُهُ عَلَى خَطَئِهِ. Yeah, this is a faqih. One who gets it right more than they get it wrong. Which means they get it wrong. They do get it wrong sometimes. Yeah? But when it's someone that you trust, like a Ghazali or a Bukhari or someone like that, then you say, oh, that becomes a very strong thing. And so determining that they actually said it becomes critical. Okay? Determining that they actually said it becomes critical. Sometimes when people hear a statement from a scholar that they think, well, that can't be right. Did he say that? The first thing that they do is they look at the chain of transmission. Are you sure you heard him right? Are you sure that that person that you heard it from is trustworthy? Are you sure the book hasn't been changed? That someone didn't come along later and change the book? Yeah, so Ghazali, for example, in Faisal al-Tafriqa, he says, talking about the Ahl al-Fitra, the people of Fitra, those who are under divine amnesty. So he says the Ahl al-Fitra, this is Ashari Aqidah, people whom the message has not reached, the divine message has not reached, are Ahl al-Fitra. Alright? They are under a divine amnesty and they are, with conditions, not accountable for not believing in God. With conditions, but there will be, there's a group of people on the Day of Judgment, God will say to them, did you believe? Yes. Sorted, mu'mineen. There are a group of people who will be said, did you believe? No. But that then divides. And there's a group of people that said, the message came to us. The message came to us and we rejected it. Those are disbelievers. There's another group of people, however, who will say, the message did not come to us. We did not know. We did not know. And there is it's a point of theological debate, even among the Sunni schools, as to what is the fate of such a person. Okay? The Asharis will say that person is under a divine amnesty. They're not believers. They're not disbelievers either, because they didn't reject faith. They are people to whom the message did not come. The next question is, who has received the message? So within that, you will have some scholars who will say, anyone who has heard the name Muhammad, anyone who has heard that there was a prophet called Muhammad, has heard enough. Has heard enough. If they then didn't go and investigate further, that's on their head. Okay? On the other end of that spectrum, you've got people like Ghazali. And Ghazali says, in Faisal al-Tafriqa, he says, now most people would agree that, for example, the message of Isa alayhi salam came, the message got corrupted, the people in between Isa alayhi salam and the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, well, where would they find the guidance? Everyone is saying Jesus is God. So where would they find the true guidance? They couldn't find the true guidance. Okay, fine, they are Ahl al-Fitra. What about the people in the now? Ghazali says, what about the people now? And he says, even the people in Rome, in Europe, the Christians in Europe, if they've heard of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam at all, they have only heard that this is a man who makes people worship an idol of himself in Mecca, or something along those lines. Yeah, they have not. Those people have not received the message. Those people are Ahl al-Fatra. Some scholars were so disturbed by this that they said this must have been interpolated into Ghazali's work. Someone must have come along later and added that sentence in, because Ghazali couldn't have said that. Ghazali couldn't have said that, because that's just wrong. Now here you've got to be careful. Maybe it's actually what Ghazali believed. And you look at the, it's a difficult one to make the argument. An example of a scholar who makes that argument, Ala Hazrat. Ala Hazrat says, it's not the words of Ghazali. Someone has added the words in. On what basis? The last one. Not because you found a manuscript where those words are not there or anything like that. It's because he couldn't have said that. He wouldn't have said that. You're on shaky ground. Lots of scholars said lots of things. If you can't say every time a scholar disagrees with my position, then I'm sure he didn't say it. Because you can't square the fact that someone that you have respect and veneration for could say something different to what you think. You need to be careful about this. Yeah, Sad. Now that's a very good question. The scholars and this is part of the reason we're studying this, because actually Shaykh Abdullah bin Bayah said something very nice. He said there are two visions of what Islam is that have been competing with each other for about 700-800 years. There is the Ghazalian vision and the Taymiyan vision, the Ibn Taymiyan vision. And he says that for 800 years the Ghazalian vision dominated Muslim discourse. But for the last 150 years, the Ibn Taymiyan vision has dominated Muslim discourse. Right? So what that means in this context is because Ghazali said it, because Ghazali came out and said it, people would have said, scholars who came after him, theologians who came after him would have said, yeah, okay. Because it's a mas'ala in aqidah. And actually, I mean, to draw a line under this, I mean, it's an interesting mas'ala, at the end of the day, the answer to the question, if someone asks you the question, because this is the question, it's very relevant today. The question is, will Jews and Christians go to hell? That's the question, right? And you can get into all sorts of trouble with this question. You get into all sorts of trouble, right? Because you can say, yes. Right? Yes. I read an interview, a very brief interview with Yusuf Islam recently. Yeah? In fact, just the other day. And they ask a few questions to get some answers, basically, like one-line answers. What is your greatest fear? What do you think Yusuf Islam said? Hell. Hellfire, specifically. Hellfire. Now, you read that in a national newspaper, and you do kind of go, whoa. And that's me going, whoa. Because he's right. But people don't talk about hell. It's not good manners to talk about hell. Certainly not fearing hell. Even we rarely talk about fearing hell. We talk about God's mercy and this and God's divine. We don't talk about hell. Yeah? So it's uncomfortable. So you can say, yes, Jews and Christians are going to hell. Because they disbelieve in the Prophet ﷺ. But you can also say, no. Because maybe they haven't received the message. Or they've received a distorted version of the message. Or when they hear about Islam, all they think about, some redneck hillbilly living in North Carolina, yeah. When you talk about the Muslims, yeah, all he knows about Muslims is those are the guys that they're like commies. Exactly if you spoke about commies, 30 years ago. So he doesn't know anything about Islam. Yes, he's heard there's a religion called Islam, but those are the people that enslave schoolgirls, aren't they? That's who the Muslims are. They enslave schoolgirls. they blew up. They hate everything that we stand for, and all that other stuff. So has he received the message? Now you can make an argument, but you're not going to make that whole theological argument in the course of that 10-second clip, are you? Yeah. Now you can get into big trouble with this stuff. Okay. And the simplest thing is to say God will decide, but even that's not properly an answer. But that's the reality of it, that Allah will decide. Allah knows in whose heart He's placed faith, in whose heart He hasn't placed faith, who the message went to, who the message didn't go to. Allah will know. Allah will just determine this. It's not for us to judge. And the shortest answer to this is, it is not for us to judge. It's for God to decide. Alright? But Shaykh Adib Kallas, who was a great theologian of Damascus, passed away about 10 years ago, he, in answer to this, one of my teachers, Shaykh Faraz, he says, I really used to press him on this point, keep on asking him. And eventually he got tired. He said, look, we believe that those who have rejected the message will be in hellfire forever. But we do not say with any conviction what specifically entails in that person's situation rejection of the message. That we leave to God, and Allah is not going to ask your opinion on the Day of Judgment. So what precisely constitutes rejection of the message is an unclear matter, and we do not delve into unclear matters. All we affirm is that those who have rejected the message, khalidina finnar. Okay? So this is where these things become very important. What did Ghazali actually say? And did he change his mind, which is the second thing here. Principles of chronology. Okay? The principles of chronology. 1 second for me. Or questions rather about chronology. Understanding which work came before which allows one to trace intellectual development, maturation of a scholar over their life. We spoke about this last week, as well as to determine clearly their final positions on a matter. There's a principle of law here, رجوع المجتهد نسخه, which means if a mujtahid leaves a position for another position, he has abrogated his earlier position. This is an abrogation of his earlier position. It no longer stands. Abu Hanifa, for example, his legal position was that you can only wipe over leather socks. Right? You can only wipe over leather socks. That was his position throughout his life. Okay? 3 or 4 days before he died, he was in discussions with his students, and he famously, this is a very famous incident, he says, no, you're right. Actually, I've changed my mind. You can wipe over non-leather socks. You can wipe over non-leather socks. The position that Abu Hanifa held for pretty much his entire life, which is that it's not permissible to wipe over non-leather socks, he changed it in the last 3 days before his life. What is the fatwa of Abu Hanifa? You can wipe over non-leather socks. With the conditions, obviously, but you can wipe over non-leather socks. Right? That change of position abrogates the first position completely. Okay? Right. So, simple principles. If A is referenced in B, A must have been written before B. Okay? If B is referenced in C, then A must have come first, then B, and then C. Alright? Alright? And if B is promised in A, it must have come after it. And Ghazali does all of those things. The chronology then. It's impossible to be completely clear about the ordering of his works. Several attempts by modern scholars. Interestingly, I don't think any of the classical scholars attempted to actually order the works. But there were several attempts made by modern scholars to develop chronologies of Ghazali's works, each built on the next. This one that I've got here is based on Professor George Hurani, who was a great Arabist from America. He was, I think, a Coptic Christian, but he did a chronology of Ghazali's works in 1959, and then he revisited it nearly 30 years later in 1984 in light of other research and so forth. But what I've done with this is, rather than give a precise chronology, I'll break this what you have here breaks the works down into the 4 famous periods of his life. The works that he composed as a student, the works that he composed as a leading scholar in Baghdad and Muaskar, the works that he composed as a wandering Sufi, and the works that he composed in his retirement, inverted commas, when he went back to those. These are the 4 phases that we've covered. I've also broken the works down by subject. Okay? So into theology, philosophy, fiqh, usul al-fiqh, and tasawwuf. The most important works are in bold. Okay? And in that last column that you'll see, I color code the works because that's all the other things that he wrote, and I color code them into subject groups as well. The last thing here, just as a reference, the spacing of the boxes indicates the rough chronology within those periods. So you'll find, let's have a look and see that. For example, let's go across to here. So if you look at this, you'll see there's 2 major works of philosophy, right? The Maqasid and the Tahafut. All right? There's 2 companion works in logic. And you see in the next column it says 5 polemic works against Ismaili Shiism. And there's this big gap. Well, that gap is there because he did write the works on Shiism after he wrote the works on philosophy and logic. Okay? And he wrote in blue al-Iqtisad fil i'tiqad, his major work on theology, after he wrote the works against Shiism. So there is some attempt to provide a chronology of sorts within that. All right. I'm obviously not going to go through all the works, but the major topics he wrote on in his life: fiqh, usulul fiqh, then the tasawwuf, then theology, logic, and philosophy, and then the other stuff that he wrote as well. And these are only his major works, not his short little epistles. I haven't put those in. Okay. I'm not going to go through all of this, obviously, because it'll just be lots of words in Arabic. So that's not really much. There's not really much point. Of note are the works that are in bold. The works that are in bold are the most important works that he wrote. So the Wajiz, for example, the Mankhul fil Usul, the Maqasid al-Falasifa, Tahafut, Mi'yar al-Ilm, Iqtisad, Mustazhiriyya, and so forth. The other thing that you see here is you'll see lots of gaps. Those gaps are important. The gaps are important. Ghazali, for example, in philosophy, he didn't write any. He only wrote on philosophy while he was pretty much while he was in Baghdad. There are no works on theology, logic, philosophy while he was a student. Okay, there's no works on tasawwuf and akhlaq until right at the end of his period in Baghdad. There's a huge gap here where he didn't write anything on this subject. If you look at fiqh, after this period in Baghdad, there's actually very little that he wrote on fiqh after this period. Yeah, right. Even a work that you'll see right at the end here, right? Nasihat al-Muluk probably wasn't really a fiqh book. I put it in there because it was kind of fiqhy, but even that was more about. I just ran out of space here in this column, to be honest. You can see that this period here, from the Ihya all the way down this column, the column of Tasawwuf and Akhlaq becomes full. But you see that the theology, he didn't stop writing on theology. Okay? So it gives you an idea what he was writing on when, and that's the use of the chronology, and that you recognize some of the important works in the field. Okay? That's all I'm going to say about this, unless anyone's got any particular questions about this particular thing. Have a look at it. Again, this is for reference. This way of breaking down Ghazali's works, I haven't found it anywhere else. Someone else may have done it. I haven't found it. I haven't found it anywhere. So it's a useful reference point. Okay? It's a useful reference point. Okay. So let's look at some of the works that Ghazali then wrote. And here we're going to look at the works, but we're also going to look at his influence. The first thing we're going to talk about is Ghazali's place in Shafi'i fiqh. Okay? So, brief history of Shafi'i fiqh. It starts, believe it or not, with Imam al-Shafi'i. Right? Shafi'i, in his long career as a jurist, his career is broken up into 2 phases. What's called the Madhab Qadim and the Madhab Jadid. Or Shafi'i Qadim and Shafi'iyya Jadid. Right? Shafi'i's old school and his new school. There was a period, Shafi'i, he studied with Malik initially. He studied, obviously, but he's one of his major teachers with Malik. He then went to Iraq. He studied with some of the Malikis in Iraq, and at this point he was pretty much Maliki. Then he started to formulate his own positions He was a very charismatic person, was Imam al-Shafi'i. He met Imam Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani, studied with Imam Muhammad, the great Hanafi scholar, in Baghdad, and he developed a school of law, which he taught to students in Iraq and places like this. Then some of the students of Imam Muhammad made some pretty thoroughgoing refutations of Shafi'i's school. Okay? Shafi'i, not just because of that, but also because of political tensions, went to Egypt. He went to Mecca first. He stayed in Mecca for a long time. Then he went to Egypt. And in Egypt, he completely reformulated his school from the ground up, basically. And that's known as the Shafi'i Jadid, the new school of Shafi'i. And Egypt at this time was seriously Maliki. I mean, it was seriously Maliki. You had, at this point when Shafi'i was there, you had some of the major students of Malik. The big students of Malik were present. And Shafi'i is basically kind of criticizing the Maliki school. Didn't go down very well, to be honest. Some say that Shafi'i was actually killed, or he died as a result of injuries that he suffered when he was attacked. Okay? But this was Shafi'i's new school. Now, the Shafi'i school then, it develops in, it has two great early figures in the Shafi'i school, like the Hanafis have Abu Yusuf and Muhammad. The Shafi'is have two great students of Malik, Buwaiti and Muzani. Alright? And they kind of formulated the Shafi'i school. They wrote very brief summaries of Shafi'i fiqh, the equivalent of Quduri and that type of stuff. They wrote those works. And the Shafi'i school develops along two traditions. Tradition one is the Iraqi Shafi'i school. And this was the school of Shirazi, really exemplified by a great scholar called Shirazi, who was Ghazali's predecessor at the Nizamiya in Baghdad. And the second was the Khurasani school of Shafi'i fiqh. And its great exemplar was Juwayni. The teacher of Ghazali, who was teaching at the Nizamiya in Nisapur. And these were different in certain aspects. They were different things. Juwayni wrote a work in which he summarized the four main works of Shafi'i fiqh, which is the al-Umm of Shafi'i himself, the Imla, which is Shafi'i's dictations, and the Mukhtasars of Buwaiti and Muzani. I'm not expecting you to become experts in Shafi'i fiqh at this point. But he took the four early great works of the Shafi'is and put them together in a work called Nihayatul Matlab or Nihayatul Matlub. Okay? Ghazali then takes Nihayatul Matlub and he summarizes it. And he summarizes Nihayatul Matlub once in Al-Basit. Then he summarizes Al-Basit to form the Wasit or the Wasit. Then he summarizes the Wasit to form the Wajiz. And the Wajiz becomes his formulation of Shafi'i fiqh. Ghazali was the last great master of the Khurasani Shafi'i school. Right? He was the great formulator. Because Nihayatul Matlab was like this big. And this big is too big. Ghazali took it and he just condensed it down. He condensed it down brilliantly. And he wrote the Wajiz. The Wajiz was then taken by the two great figures of the late Shafi'i school, al-Rafi'i and al-Nawawi. Now the word Nawawi, ears prick up. You know Nawawi, right? So Nawawi, you're going for hadith, but Nawawi was the great compiler of the Shafi'i school. Alright? What happened here? Rafi'i and Nawawi brought these two great tariqas, the Iraqi Shafi'i school, the Khurasani Shafi'i school, and he brings them together. How does Rafi'i was about 100 years before, or 50, 60 years before Nawawi. How does he do it? Rafi'i takes the Wajiz. He takes the Wajiz and he summarizes it. Okay, he summarizes it in a work called Al-Muharrar. Then he wrote a commentary on the Wajis. Imam Nawawi then takes the commentary and summarizes it into any Shafi'is here. Rawd al-Talibin wa Umdat al-Muftin was a summary of Rafi'i's sharh of Ghazali's work. Right? So that's how you go. And Rawd al-Talibin, then he takes Rafi'i's condensation of the Wajis, and he summarizes that further into Minhaj, into al-Minhaj. These are the central works of the Shafi'i school. Rawdat al-Talibin and the Minhaj are the two central works of the Shafi'i school. The entire Shafi'i school, after that period, so from the 7th century until that time, is based on the Minhaj and the Rawdah, basically. Okay? Both of those are grandchildren of the Wajis. Both of them are grandchildren of the Wajis, basically. And Nawawi wrote other works. He wrote, and we won't go much into that. But put it this way, the Minhaj al-Talibin itself has over 100 commentaries written on it. There's over 100 commentaries, okay? And that's become then the basis of the Shafi'i school. So you can see that Ghazali was a central figure. He was a central figure in the Shafi'i madhab. And it's from the work that he wrote that the later Shafi'i school developed. Okay? So that's his influence, and that I hopefully will summarize his place in terms of Shafi'i fiqh. So had Ghazali just done that and nothing else, he would have been a great scholar of the Shafi'i school. Okay? But he did more than that. The next thing is about Ghazali and his development of legal theory. Ghazali was always interested in legal theory. One of the first books that he wrote was al-Mankhul fil Usul. Okay, it's on your diagrams. Al-Mankhul fil Usul, right? Literally, it means Mankhul means to sift. Nakhl is to sift something. That you use a sieve and to sift something. Okay, and he took Juwayni's great work, the Burhan, his great work in Usul al-Fiqh, and he summarized it. Again, he summarized it down. Very early work. He wrote and he shows in that work some evidence of independent legal thinking. He wrote another work called Tahdhib al-Usul, which was his own work of Usul, basically, which was a long work in Usul al-Fiqh. But the great work was al-Mustasfa min ilm al-Usul. Okay, literally the quintessence of Usul al-Fiqh, the quintessence of Usul al-Fiqh. Okay, it was his last major work. His last major work, right? And according to Ibn Khaldun, who was a great Muslim historian and who's a great scholar himself, he says this is one of the most important works on Usul ever written. One of the 4 most important works on Usul ever written. Okay? One of the things that Ghazali did in the Mustasfa is he brought logic front and center. The introduction of the Mustasfa is about logic and the need for logic and the need for reason. And he gives a very strong defense of reason as the interpretive tool for revelation. So our fiqh is based on revelation, but interpreted through reason. Interpreted through reason. And we'll talk about his defense of logic a bit later on, but in terms of Mustasfa, one of the most important things about the Mustasfa was that he was the first jurist really to he was the first jurist to expound the theory of maqasid al-Sharia. Now, how many of you know about this, maqasid al-Sharia? A few of you, some of you have not done it yet. Maqasid al-Sharia, that every rule of the Sharia returns to a wisdom, to one of 5 central wisdoms. And those 5 central wisdoms are the preservation of religion, or of spiritual, let me put it another way, the 5 universal human rights. The right to know God, okay? The right to life, the right to intellect and thought, the right to family life, and the right to wealth, or the right to property. Okay? There are other formulations of it. They form the basis of, so the whole of the fiqh of family law, marriage, divorce, etc. is all about the right to family life, the right to a family. Okay? The whole of trade is basically about the right to own property and to have disposal over your own property. To not have your wealth just taken away from you by someone. Okay? The right to life, the right to religion, and so forth. Okay? These are called the kulliyatul khams. The kulliyatul khamsa, the 5 universals. The first person to, now they have always been present in the law. They were present even when if you could look at the Hanafi usage of istihsan, of juristic preference, it's very much based. You can now, looking back, you can see, oh, okay, Abu Hanifa was talking about the right to life. Abu Hanifa was talking about the right to, preservation of property, justice, etc., etc. But the first person to make this explicit was Ghazali. In the Mustasfa. And that has influenced the whole of legal theory from his time onwards. Pretty much every single development in legal theory from Ghazali's time onwards has been predicated in some way around the maqasid al-Sharia and how you use the maqasid al-Sharia and so forth. Okay? And so, as it said here, it formed the basis of usul al-fiqh going forward, and along with the work of his teacher, al-Juwayni, it was, which is the Burhan, it was the basis of usul al-fiqh going forwards from there, thenceforward. So, that's Ghazali in terms of fiqh and usul al-fiqh. Now in terms of theology. How are we doing for time? Okay. Ghazali was the greatest, the student of the greatest dialectic theologian of the age. Now at this point, I'm bearing in mind who I'm talking, that you haven't studied some of this stuff. So, what is the difference between Aqidah? I should have mentioned this in Usul al-Fiqh. What's Usul al-Fiqh? Let's go back a slide, sorry. I forgot. What's Usul al-Fiqh? So Usul al-Fiqh is a machine. Alright? Usul al-Fiqh is a machine. It's a computer. You put data in and it spits out a ruling at the other end. That's what Usul al-Fiqh is. Alright? You say, here's the situation. What are we talking about? That abortion case. Here's the situation. Here's the Quranic verses. Here's a hadith. Put it into the machine. It goes to the machine and you come up with a ruling at the end. That ruling is the fiqh. That's the legal ruling, that's the mas'ala and the answer. What does the machine do? How does the machine work? How does the machine come to a ruling? What does it weigh up? What does it give precedence to? What does it prioritize? That machine is usulul fiqh. You had, in the early history of Islam, about 300 machines. About 300 machines. About 150 years later, you had 4 left. You had 4 left. Okay? Why? Some of the machines weren't very good. They just weren't very good machines. Yeah, they broke down. If you put the wrong type of ingredients into them, they don't know what to do. You get an error. You get an error message. Okay? Sometimes they'd spit something out, but it would be something, misshapen, misformed, malformed. Okay? Sometimes you'd put things in, alright, but actually you find if you put the same thing into 2 machines, the product that you get out from one end of the machine is a lot better than the product you get from the other machine. So that second machine, it just stops being used after a while. So there are all these legal theories, these mechanisms for interpreting the law, interpreting the Quran and the Sunnah. And what ended up was you ended up with 4 of them. And those 4 machines were the Hanafi machine, the Shafi'i machine, the Hanbali machine, and the Maliki machine. Everything after that has been about sorting the machines out. There have always been, and there still will be, and there will always be people who try to build machines in their garage. And that's your funeral. If you want to try and build a machine, that's fine, right? When Richard Branson, is building a machine to take you to space, and that thing disintegrates in midair at kind of 60,000 miles an hour or whatever it is, I ain't getting in that machine. You can go in that machine if you want to. I'm not getting in that machine. Yeah, if I need to travel where is it? Where's Atif? We were going Atif to going to Syria to deliver stuff. If you'd come along in your kind of, you brought a decent van that had been MOT'd and that sort of stuff, right? And it worked and it got to the end. There were guys that came along and the ambulance broke down in Dover. Forget anywhere else. It's like we pull up at the service station to start this great trek across Europe, and the thing doesn't start. What kind of a machine is that? I'm not getting in that machine. Yeah, I want the one that has that connection, what's the cigarette lighter connection, so that if I want to have warm tea, I can just stick it and have warm tea. I don't want the one that doesn't have that, so I'm drinking cold tea for 7 days. Right? This is what happened, and through this process of kind of natural selection, really, what you got was the survival of the fittest. Thereafter, it was just a case of tricking out your machines, making them work even better. Okay, that's usul al-fiqh. What's theology? All right, theology. There's a difference between aqidah and kalam. Have you heard these words? Aqidah and kalam. Yes, both mean theology. What's the difference? One's philosophical and the other is revelation and text. Kalam means dialogue. Aqidah came afterwards. Alright? Anyone else? Saad's got his hand up. Yeah, go on, Saad.
Aqidah is simply stating what the critical points are, whereas Kalam is discussing them and trying to find a rational basis for it.
Okay, so this is the difference. Aqidah is what you believe. At most, it's what you believe with the shawahid min al-Quran wa sunnah, right? We believe God is one because Allah says, wa ilahukum ilahum wahid. Your Lord is one God. Alright? So we believe God is one because Allah says God is one. Alright? We believe that there will be a resurrection because Allah says, وَاتَّقُوا يَوْمًا تُرْجَعُونَ فِيهِ إِلَى اللَّهِ. Because fear the day that you will be brought back to your Lord. So this is aqidah. Kalam is an attempt to establish a rational basis for those beliefs. God is one. Why is God one? How do you know God is one? You say, La ilaha illallah. How do you know God is one? Allah says in the Quran, God is one. قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ وَإِلَهُكُمْ إِلَهٌ وَاحِدٌ. This is aqidah. Kalam is this. God is defined as the necessarily perfect being. A necessarily perfect being must have power over all things. If there were two gods who were both necessarily existent and both had ultimate power over all things, then if one God willed you to stand and the other God willed you to sit, which would happen? Both gods are omnipotent. Are you standing or are you sitting? If you're standing, it means that God 1 is more powerful than God 2, which means that God 2 is not omnipotent, which means that God 2 is not God. If you're sitting, it means that God 2 is more powerful than God 1, which means that God 1 is not omnipotent, which means that He is not God, so you've only got one God left. If you are neither standing nor sitting, which is impossible because you're either standing or if you lie down, it means that neither God has been able to achieve what they wanted, so neither of them are all powerful, which means that neither of them are God. And if you're both standing and sitting at the same time, that's impossible. Right? Therefore, there can only be one God. That's why it's called kalam. Because it's a lot of talking. It's a lot of talking. But kalam is an attempt to establish a rational basis. So in all that stuff that I just said to you now, which is called dalil al-tamanu', right, the proof of mutual contradiction or the proof of mutual opposition, right? There is not one Quranic verse in there. There's not one hadith in there. You're saying the same thing, God is one, but you're establishing a completely rational basis for it. Why? You go to your neighbor and say, God is one. They say, well, how do you know? It's because the Quran says so. How do you know the Quran is true? Because God says so. Hey? Well, I don't believe the Quran, so why should I believe that God is one? Now what are you going to do? Now you're stuck. But we all would agree that you can't be standing and sitting at the same time. We all would agree that if you might like a tug of war, and if I'm tugging this way and you're tugging that way and you pull me, then you're stronger than me. We can all agree on that. So it forms a basis of universal discussion. And kalam is I mean, you all study it as you go through, but it's a very interesting science. But it entails that you know logic. Please understand that. There are so many people I know that have studied kalam, don't know the first thing about logic, or they've studied 3 textbooks in logic, but they don't know anything about logic. And it's amazing that people can study 3 texts in logic, but not be able to formulate a logical argument, other than the ones that they found in the textbook. That's just astonishing, but it happens. Okay? Psyche had a question.
I was going to say, so would it be fair to say that kalam is a necessary innovation? And if it is
Good. Now, here we go. Is kalam a necessary innovation? Ghazali tackles exactly that point. We will get to it in its time. Ghazali effectively says, now kalam in his time, and he's a student of Juwayni, and Juwayni was one of the greatest theologians ever to have lived. Formal theologians we're talking about, right? Formal scholars of kalam ever to have lived, it's Juwayni. Okay? And Ghazali kind of went, it's alright. That was Ghazali's basic response to kalam. And what he said is that, he used an analogy, and when we do the Book of Belief we'll come to it, but he uses an analogy. He says, if you want to make Hajj and the road is safe, you don't need any guards. Right? There's no highway robbers, nothing like that. You don't need any guards. You just go for Hajj. Okay? It's only when the road is dangerous. It's only when there's highway robbers. When there's packs of wolves roaming around. And that sort of stuff. Now you need guards. He says the mutakallimin are security guards. Basically, they're security guards. They need to be there because the road is dangerous. The pathway to the hereafter, the Sirat al-Mustaqim, is beset by highway robbers, by wolves, the shayateen, people of bid'ah, min al-jinnati wan-nas, from among jinn and among men, trying to take you away, trying to rob you of your iman. And so you need the mutakallimin not to get to Hajj, but to get to Hajj safely. The mutakallimin are not the guides on the path. They don't show you how to get to Hajj. They protect you while you're getting to Hajj. And this did not make him very popular. But nobody could say anything to him, because he was the great student of Juwayni. Alright? So, he was dissatisfied with dialectic theology as a means of attaining truth. And we'll do this next week, inshallah. But he did see its value as a protective science. And he confronted the most dangerous heresies of his age, which were the Ismaili Shi'ism, the Batiniya. He wrote 5 full works against Batiniya. And Greek and Avicennian philosophy. Okay? But, and this is the important thing, he also, and this is the greatness of Ghazali. As I said last week, he didn't simply say, that's kufr, that's kufr, that's kufr. What he did is, because of his position, because of his status, because of his towering intellect, but also because of the spiritual process he had gone through, and his experiential taste for God, and taste of the truth, he was able in all 3 ways, emotionally, intellectually, and by dint of who he was, to filter, to do nakhl, to sift out the things in Greek philosophy that were useful, like logic, right? Like some of the arguments, like Aristotelian arguments, but also to discard those that were problematic. And that's what he did. And his great contribution was to do this, that he incorporated some aspects of philosophy into Orthodox Islam. They became part of Islam. Some of the arguments for the proofs of God, for example, right? The rational arguments for the proofs of God are used even today. The strongest argument, modern argument for the existence of God, which is called the modified cosmological argument, which is proposed by people like William Lane Craig, who's a Christian theologian, all right, is Ghazali's argument. Not even Ghazali's argument restated, just Ghazali's argument. exactly Ghazali's argument. All he's done is added more maths into it. But he simply takes, and he calls it, to be fair to him, he says this is the Kalam cosmological argument. This is the cosmological argument as adduced by the scholars of Kalam. First person to do so, Ghazali. Actually, probably wasn't even Ghazali. It was probably in its prototypic form, Ibn Sina, the philosopher. Ghazali took that and he said, that's good, actually. That's really good. I'm going to have that. Yeah? This is in sync with revelation. And that's what he did. Ghazali was a great filtering transmitter. He would take the truth from wherever it was. But he would take it all and he'd filter it. He'd distinguish the gold from the glitter. He'd keep the gold, he would distinguish the glitter, and he would get rid of that which was forgery. That's exactly the argument he says in the Munqidh, when he was criticized for doing this. And he says a common person who puts his hand into the bag of a counterfeiter does not know if he is pulling out gold or he is pulling out an adulterated counterfeit coin. Okay? But the fact is, an expert in coins can distinguish between gold and counterfeit. And the fact is, there is gold in that bag. There is gold in that bag. If you are an expert, you can go to the counterfeiter's bag, because you'll only pull out the gold and you'll leave the counterfeit stuff behind. Okay? So he authored 3 works in theology. The greatest of them was the Iqtisad, and we'll speak more about that inshallah when we're going through the Ihya, and we'll look at its place. Logic, we'll do this fairly briefly, but Ghazali played a central role in the formal adoption of logic into the Islamic curriculum. Muslim scholars had always thought in logical ways. Abu Hanifa, very logical in his thinking, so was Shafi'i, so was Malik. Logic in terms of thinking clearly, in terms of not contradicting yourself, has of course been there from the beginning, and every culture and every civilization has been founded on logical principles. What the Greeks did was they formalized the logical principles. They formalized them. So they said, if all A is B and all B is C, then all A is C. Right? Now that's obvious when you think about it. Okay? If all dogs are mammals and all mammals are animals, then clearly all dogs must be animals. Because you've got dogs, and they're part of animals, dogs which are part of mammals, which are part of animals. So you've got 3 circles, right? And if you're this little circle, and you're in the medium-sized circle, then you must be in the big circle too. Okay? So that's what logic is, and the Greeks formalized this. Aristotelian logic was the great formulation of logic, basically, right? And all these principles were put down. Ghazali took those principles, he said, yes, this is good. In the 2 years that he spent studying philosophy, he said, this is good stuff. What he did, he incorporated it into the teaching of religion. Okay? And he made it, because of his prestige, he made it acceptable to formally study logic. Okay? He was deeply schooled in Aristotelian logic and effectively championed its usage. He removed a lot of the suspicion towards logic. Because people said, logic, that's like philosophy. It's a bit like me saying to you, it's okay to study biology. Oh no, that's the stuff of evolution. I don't study biology. No, it's okay to study biology. Just watch out, just know your doctrine well. But then yes, by all means go and study biology. Go study genetics. Go and be a geneticist. Go and find a medication that targets genes found specifically in cancer cells. So you can find this mystical magic bullet that will only kill the cancer cells and nothing else. By all means go and do that. There's no problem doing that, as long as you understand your theology well. Yeah? But there was a lot of suspicion about logic, because logic is those weird Greeks, and those are those weird Greeks that say all these other weird things as well. And what Ghazali did again was that filtering process. In the Mi'yarul Ilm, he reformulated logic in fiqhi terms. Okay? In Qistas al-Mustaqim, which was the just balance or the straight balance, what he did very interestingly, he demonstrated the 5 main syllogisms of formal logic from the Quran. From the Quran. He took the Quran and he said, here is an example of a conditional syllogism. Here is an example of a a connective syllogism. Here is an example of a disjunctive conditional syllogism. If A, there is no B. If the sun is shining, it is not night. And he showed examples from the Quran of all these formal syllogisms. Okay? Right. And he says, for example, in Al-Mustasfa, knowledge is of 3 kinds. Purely rational, with no shari'i connotations, like maths. Then purely revelatory sciences, like hadith and tafsir, right? Which are not difficult, he says. But the noblest sciences are those where reason and revelation are combined, such as fiqh and usul. They can neither be manipulated by reason, such that the Sharia could not accept them, nor are they entirely based on blind following, such that reason cannot attest to them. Okay? Okay. Then we come to Ghazali in terms of philosophy. So again, just a brief history of philosophy. What have you got? You've got the ancient philosophical systems. So again, it's a quick history lesson, 3-minute history lesson. You've got the ancient philosophical systems, right? And of them, the greatest of them was a Greek philosophy. You had Hindu philosophy, you had Buddhist philosophy, you had all sorts of different types, but they were very mystical and spiritual. The one that was really rationally based was Greek philosophy, Hellenistic philosophy. And you had a number of different figures there. In around the 2nd century, during the Khilafah of Ma'mun, one of the Abbasid Caliphs, you have the establishment of something called Dar al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. And the House of Wisdom was perhaps the greatest translation and adoption of knowledge project until modern times, that had ever been seen in the world until modern times. Basically, you could bring any work from anyone to the House of Wisdom and translate it into, and it would be translated into Arabic. So in the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, there were works, the Vedas were translated into Arabic. Okay, you had, the great Persian works translated into Arabic. And you had a huge number of Greek works translated into Arabic. Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, and so forth. All of these were translated into Arabic. It was the greatest intellectual endeavor that the world had ever seen, pretty much until Wikipedia. Pretty much until Wikipedia. It was the ancient equivalent of Wikipedia. In some circumstances, depending on your prestige and the work that you were translating and how valuable it was, you would be paid the weight of the manuscript in gold. That will be your payment. So you'd get, and of course what you would do is write big. You would write big. And you get the weighty manuscript, stick it at one end of the scale, gold would be filled up to the other end of the scale until they balance, and that was your fee. Okay? This was an amazing thing, the translation movement. But, of course, what it did was introduce a whole lot of chaos. Because now you've got access to all these different ideas, different thoughts, and so forth, and especially Greek philosophy had very significant effects. Shi'ism, we've spoke about it last week, the Ikhwan al-Safa, the Brethren of Purity, they were called, the Mu'tazilis, and Ibn Sina and al-Farabi, they introduced a whole lot of confusion. Because, yes, you've got all this stuff now suddenly in Arabic, but you don't know what to do with it. You don't have a balance in your own mind. You don't have a standard yourself to know how to weigh up this Quran and the Sunnah. And remember that knowledge of Arabic and stuff had weakened at this stage. So what the Sahaba took from Quran and Sunnah is not what people in the 3rd century were taking from Quran and Sunnah. Yeah? And you've got all these other fashionable ideas about, mutual contradiction and syllogisms, and it sounds really exciting. Okay? What did Ghazali do? Ghazali was par excellence the philosopher theologian. Subki says he came when people were more in need of guidance then a traveler in the darkest of nights is in need of a light. Alright? The Muslim world was in danger of being overwhelmed by this, as Christian theology was overwhelmed by Greek philosophy. All these ideas about Trinity, about Jesus being God but man at the same time, being the Son of God but also God. These were all really on the basis of Gnostic ideas that were present at that time, at the turn of the millennium, and the effects of Greek philosophy and of the philosophies of the Near East. And a very similar thing was in danger of happening in Islam. And so the response was, philosophy is all of the traditionalists. So you've got the right wing and the left wing. The right wing, the traditionalists, the Ahlul Hadith and so forth, saying basically all this stuff is kufr. Just forget all of it. Stick to the Hadith. Right? Because it was at this time also in the Muslim world, 4th, 6th centuries, you have the rise of the Hadith movement. The Hadith assume now a central importance intellectually. Why? It was a reaction to Greek philosophy. Everyone knew the Hadith were important. But that important, that crucial, the Hadith it was never called the Quran movement. It was called the Hadith movement. Why? Because as a source of revelation, yeah, we all accept that. But that wasn't the question in the 3rd and 4th centuries. The question was, okay, it's a source of revelation, so we've got minds, we've got brains, which takes precedence? Your intellect or what's in the Hadith? And this was the great, I mean, there have been a number of iterations of this debate over the course of the centuries. But at this stage it was, should reason take precedence or should revelation take precedence? What did al-Ghazali do? He brought them together. He said, reason, if it is sound, supports revelation. So yes, you can use reason. Yes, you can use logical principles. Yes, you can incorporate philosophical ideas. But in defense of what is already present in revelation. And those aspects of philosophy that are contrary to revelation can be demonstrated to be illogical. And that's the thing. Ghazali did not disprove the problematic elements of philosophy from revelation. He disproved the problematic elements of philosophy from philosophy. He used philosophy itself to show the incoherence of those ideas of philosophers. That's why the work is not called Tahafut al-Falsafa, not the incoherence of philosophy, but Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers. He basically, and we'll do this when we look next week, I'll explain it to you from learning theory, but he basically said, Aristotle was a master of philosophy. Ibn Sina was a master of philosophy. Guess what? I'm a master of philosophy too. Want proof? Here's Maqasid al-Falasifa. Here's my work. Take it, read it, tell me if there's any deficiency in my understanding of philosophy. No? Okay. Here's what Aristotle got wrong. Here's what Plato got wrong. Here's what Socrates got wrong. Here's what Ibn Sina got wrong. Here's what Farabi got wrong. And here's why. That was the Tahafut. And then he produced a third work called the Mi'yar al-Ilm, which is basically his work in logic, great work in logic, so that you understand what I've written in the Maqasid, and you understand what I've written in the Tahafut. Here's a glossary. Here is a glossary. This is how logic works. Read this work, then go back and read the Maqasid, then go and read the Tahafut, and then you will see. These are the beneficial aspects of philosophy. These are things that are okay. Here are the detrimental ones. 20 points, only 20 points in the Tahafut. He critiqued 20 points. A brilliant critique. 17 of them he said they are bid'ah. 3 he said are kufr. Now that's astounding when you think about it. Ghazali said 3 things that philosophers say are kufr. Only 3. The rest of them, 17, are bid'ah. Everything else, it's alright. That's staggering when you think about it, given the context of the time. But he could say it. He had the chutzpah to say it. Why? because he had the chops. He was Juwayni the second. He was Shafi'i the second. He was the great scholar of fiqh. He was the umda of the Shafi'i madhab. He was the developer of legal, the great developer of legal theory. It had nothing to do with ihya. It had to do with what he did before it. He was all of those things, and he did this before the ihya. All of this was Ghazali still in his learning curve. He hasn't hit peak yet. He hits peak in the ihya. Okay? So this was his supreme achievement, to incorporate the unproblematic elements of philosophy into theology so completely, and this is the great thing, so completely did he incorporate the unproblematic elements of philosophy into theology that you no longer needed to study philosophy. From Ghazali's time onwards, if you studied theology, you had all the philosophy you needed. And at this point, the study of philosophy in the Muslim world just went, why? Not because, can't study philosophy. It was, you don't need to. It's all in kalam. Okay? Then tasawwuf. And this is where we'll end, inshallah. Ghazali's influence on tasawwuf. And this was his greatest achievement. Of all of these achievements, this was the most enduring achievement of Ghazali. That he reunited the outward practice of Islam and the interior life of a Muslim so completely that they would never be separated again, despite all the attempts in modern times, that they would never be separated again. Now, was Ghazali a progenitor of philosophy, of tasawwuf? No. Tasawwuf was present from the very first. The most famous statement of tasawwuf is what? وَاعْبُدُ اللَّهَ كَأَنَّكَ تَرَاهُ. Yeah? Worship your Lord as though you see him. That was a great prophetic statement. That's the basis of tasawwuf. Worship your Lord as though you see him. الْإِحْسَانُ أَن تَعْبُدَ اللَّهَ كَأَنَّكَ تَرَاهُ وَإِن لَمْ تَكُنْ تَرَاهُ فَإِنَّهُ يَرَاكَ. Right? Ihsan, perfection of faith, beauty of faith, is to worship your Lord as though you are seeing him. And if you cannot do this, then be convinced that he is seeing you. Be experientially convinced that he is seeing you. That is the Islam of the Salaf. Ghazali was a Salafi. He was a Salafi. He harked back. Ghazali, as I said in previous class about Malik, Malik did not see himself as the beginning of something. Malik saw himself as the end. Malik saw himself as the end of the Medinan tradition. The end of the Medinan tradition. There is after me, no one else holds the Medinan tradition. The school of Medina, I will preserve it for the generations to come on. Ghazali was with all this stuff that we say about him, but he was backwards looking. Ghazali harked back to a simpler age, to a better time. Why can't we be Muslims like they were Muslim? That was his basic in the Ihya. This is his complaint. Why can't we be Muslim like they were Muslim? We've lost what it means to be Muslim. We've lost what it means to be true believers. We think it's all about fiqh. And as long as I've got it in place with the fiqh, then I'm okay, I'm a good Muslim. No. Where is our inward state? Where is our state with God? It's all very well, my prayer is perfect because I bow in exactly the right angle. And my feet are exactly the right distance apart. And my pronunciation is perfect. But my heart is with my business. But I've done a perfect prayer. Ghazali says you haven't done a perfect prayer. Ghazali says if your heart is not present, you are not present. If you are not present, what kind of a prayer is it? Okay? Ghazali harked back to the time of Abu Darda, to Ali, to the piety of the earliest Muslims. And Ghazali himself was part of a tradition. The spiritual path, again, another 3-minute history, the spiritual path was formalized in really the 2nd and the 3rd centuries, right? Or first to 3rd centuries. Al-Hasan, Hasan al-Basri, to Junaid, Rabi al-Basri, to Bayazid Bistami, the great the two basic, if you like, the two great flavors of tasawwuf, of divine experience, which is what? Which is sober and intoxicated. Okay? Sober tasawwuf and intoxicated tasawwuf. Right? Intoxicated tasawwuf is, I'm in love and I want everyone to know it. That's intoxicated tasawwuf. And sober tasawwuf was, I'm in love but I want to keep it to myself. And that was the difference between Junayd and Bayazid, for example. Okay? But these were formalized at that period. The great early works of tasawwuf were written in the 4th century. Al-Muhasibi's works, the Kashf al-Mahjub of Imam of Data Ganj Bakhsh, who's buried in the great saint of Lahore, the Risala of Imam al-Qushayri, the Qut al-Qulub of Abu Talib al-Makki. These works were all written. And they were written before Ghazali was born, and they influenced Ghazali greatly. So even the idea of a shaykh and a murid, that you are murid of a shaykh, this didn't come after Ghazali. This came before Ghazali. Okay, Imam al-Qushayri, Abu Qasim al-Qushayri talks about being a murid of a shaykh, taking bay'ah with a shaykh. All these things were there. Okay, but they were seen as one of two things. They were seen as the activity of an elite group of righteous people. It's the elite, those who have mastered fiqh and so forth. They are the ones who need to concern themselves with their inward state. Once you figure out how not to sin, then you can concern yourself with whether you have a problem of anger or of jealousy or something like that. Or they were seen as hippies, basically. Weirdos who do these weird things, they jump around. Like someone came to Ahmad bin Hanbal. He says, what do you think about the Sufis? And Ahmad bin Hanbal said, they are the best of the people that I know. And he says, but they enter spiritual states and listen to music. He said, would you deny them an hour of pleasure with their Lord? Yeah? So people saw them as these people are strange people. They do these weird things we don't know about. This is one of the reasons that tasawwuf was so popular in the hinterlands. Yeah? Because Khaja Mu'in Chishti goes along to India and they're singing bhajans. And he says, okay, cool, we'll sing some bhajans too. We'll also sing bhajans. And we'll call it qawwali. Right? But those bhajans will be about Allah. Will be about the Prophet ﷺ. If you like singing, we'll sing. Yeah? And so forth. This is how it happened. Yeah? There was Sheikh Babikr told us this, that there was a scholar and a Sufi, and he was in Africa. He was in the inside, in one of the tribes. And he says the people would gather around the fire, a campfire, and they would beat on drums, and they would start dancing, and they would call on their ancestors. He said, cool. Let's start a fire. We'll beat the drums, and we'll call upon Allah, or we'll call upon the Prophet ﷺ. And people said, oh, you can't do this, and this is bid'ah, and he says, yes, but how else do you bring these people? What will you say to them? Shaykh Babikr said something lovely once. He says, so there are, in Africa, Christians don't tend to convert to Islam, and Muslims don't tend to convert to Christianity. What you get is pagans. There are a lot of people who still follow African traditional religions, pagan, animistic religions. They convert to either Christianity or to Islam. When the Christian guy comes to them, he says, come become a Christian. They say, why? He says, Jesus, he was God on earth. He was the Son of God. He walked on water. He raised the dead. And they go, hey, that's pretty cool, man. That's pretty cool. Then the Muslim guy comes, right? Straight from the University of Medina. The Muslim guy comes and says, you must convert to Islam. La ilaha illallah. Muhammad Rasulullah. And he says, no, why? And he says, and who was Muhammad? He says, he was just a guy. He was just a guy. He came with a message. He's dead now. Which one do you think they're going to pick? Which one would you pick? Superman or postman? That's the choice you're being offered. He says, no, Baba. The Prophet ﷺ, man, if you start telling people about the day of judgment, the Prophet ﷺ will stand in front of hellfire. When hellfire is coming towards you, Yeah, it's coming towards the people. It's being held by 70,000 chains. Each chain being held by 70,000 angels, all of them trying to pull hellfire back, and hellfire is still advancing. And the sound that comes out of hellfire is the most awful sound, the shrieking, the most awful, terrifying sound that anyone has ever heard. And it's saying, I'm hungry, I'm hungry. And it's not backing off, it's just getting closer and closer and closer. And then the Prophet ﷺ stands in front of hellfire and says, go back. And it goes back. You tell someone that, that's who the Prophet ﷺ is. That's who the Prophet ﷺ is. And the reality of the Prophet ﷺ, we know it. But few of us have experienced it. And few of us have experienced it. We know these things because they're in the hadith. They're in the works. Yeah? But this is what, when you say, make the Prophet ﷺ, you know, that he is alive. But you make him alive in your heart. So you have a living relationship with the Prophet ﷺ. So when you hear a hadith, and I say this, you know, when we do, you know, winter, spring and stuff, but you bring your heart to this thing, to these things. Yeah, that when you are falling into hellfire, and the hand that comes to catch you is the hand of the Prophet ﷺ, and he says, come with me. And he takes you away from all the fear and the darkness and the terror and the pain, and gives you a drink that makes every suffering you've had in your life and in your afterlife disappear. That's the Prophet ﷺ. And that's what it means to have an interior life. This is about having an interior life. That your religion is not just a coat you put on when you're going outside, but it's your flesh and your blood and your bone and your marrow. Okay? So Ghazali took from these figures. Yeah? His own great teacher, Juwayni, was a good friend of Qushayri himself. One of Qushayri's main students, al-Faramdi, was basically Ghazali's Shaykh, his murshid. Okay? But the effect of Ghazali, the effect of such a great scholar, embracing tasawwuf and he says this, it's the only way to come to the truth. And you'll see this next week when you do the Munqidh. Inshallah, we go back to Ghazali's own works next week. You'll see he says this. I have looked into every group that claims to have the truth, and none of them have it, except the Sufis. None of them have it except the Sufis. And one of the reasons he said, and Shaykh Yusuf made this point, a very beautiful point. He says, Ghazali's method, his approach, is a very modern method. He says, because the way of the Sufi, that the Sufis have attained the truth, is known by experience. You can experience it. You don't have to take anyone else's word for it. If you do what they tell you to do, if you act in the way that they tell you to act, if you do those the acts of worship as you're supposed to do them and so forth, if you purify your soul, the way they tell you to purify your soul, you will experience what they experience. You don't have to take anyone's word for it. You just got to have the courage to do it. There ain't no difference between you and that Wali Allah, except he's done it, you haven't. He's at the end of the road and you're at the beginning. And you're thinking, should I take a step? Should I take a step? Ghazali, you'll see next week, himself said this. I sat there thinking, shall I take the step? Shall I take the step? Shall I not take the step? I can see the road. It looks like a cool road. It's going to be hard. Yeah? Until Allah basically came behind him and went, go. The angel of death appeared behind him. He said, okay, I'm going to go. I'm going now. Alright? Okay? But the effect of such a great scholar who had been through this, embracing tasawwuf as the only way to attain the divine truth, was incredibly powerful. It was an incredibly powerful thing. And it played a significant role in the widespread acceptance of tasawwuf. Tasawwuf was there, it existed, but in the widespread acceptance of tasawwuf. And in the notion, and the Ihya did this more than anything else, that tasawwuf, it ain't something for the elite. It's something for you. I remember once I asked, when we first started teaching PTS, I asked Dr. Sheikh Samir Nas, I said, should we teach things like anger and jealousy? And he said, because other places, they don't teach this stuff. He said, look, I said, is it Fard Ain? I said, Ghazali said it's Fard Ain. Shaykh Sami said, oh, you see, if you never get angry, then it's not Fard Ain for you. If you never experience jealousy, then you don't have to study it. So, hands up, you've never got angry. Hands up, you've never experienced jealousy or greed or anything like that. Oh, Baba, it's Fard Ain for you. And this is what Ghazali said. This is what Ghazali said. Okay, and this was the great achievement, this great synthesis, joining the outward and the inward aspects of Islam. And it's for that reason that people said about it, not just one, several people. Safariyin, he said about it. Imam as-Safadi said about it, I should say. Nawawi said, others said as well, if all the works of Islam were to be lost and only the Ihya remained, it would suffice to revive the religion. And that's a big claim to make on behalf of somebody else's work. Nawawi didn't say that about any of his own works. He didn't say it about Riyadh al-Salihin. He didn't say it about other works that he wrote. He said it about the Ihya. Why? Why is it sufficient to revive the religion? Because it combines the outward aspects of Islam, the actual fiqh, the practice, how to pray and so forth, but combined with their inward aspects. How your body prays to God and how your heart prays to God. How you fast physically and how you fast spiritually. And he combined them together. May Allah make it easy for us. It's a very sort of academic, I suppose, lesson this week. Next week, inshallah, we will we'll be going back to Ghazali's own work. We'll be looking at the Munqidh min al-Dalal. Those of you who have this work, Deliverance from Error, if you have it, you have it. You can read the first half of Deliverance from Error, up until the discussion of the ways of the Sufis, basically. Okay, and you'll have an idea. We obviously won't be reading the work; it's a long work, longish. But I'll summarize it down for you, inshallah. Okay, and we'll be discussing next week quite a lot of different aspects of the looking at, especially Ghazali's engagement with philosophy, and directly how that relates to our circumstances. Okay, how it relates. It's very similar to what we experience now, where now science is the new philosophy. If science says it's right, then it's right. Okay? And actually, our approach to science needs to be exactly the same as Ghazali's approach to philosophy, which is you need to be well grounded in your religion, and you then need to tread carefully, accept the aspects that are positive, and reject those that are not. Okay? Inshallah, we'll look at it next week. صلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.